So a few months ago, I made a video talking about some of the differences that I personally observed between American cars and Dutch cars, or rather cars in America and cars in the Netherlands. And one of the key differences that I noted, I think multiple times across multiple videos actually, was that a majority of the cars in the Netherlands and really in much of Europe are manual. Whereas here in the United States of America, very few people, other than car enthusiasts, are actually driving manual transmissions. And in that video, I asked, why is that the case? And honestly, I didn't really see an answer that I found to be a sufficient explanation. I mean, I saw people saying that a real man drives manual, or that manual cars are better because you have more control. Personally, I don't see those as sufficient explanations, but I do know that there is a sufficient pragmatic explanation out there. And the reason why I know this is because, look, I don't know about all of Europe and all Europeans, but I do know this about Dutch people specifically. Dutch people are very pragmatic people. Point blank, period. Dutch people are very pragmatic people. You're talking about a nation that collectively eats cheese sandwiches for lunch every day. Very pragmatic. And because of this, I know that there is a pragmatic solution, or a pragmatic explanation rather, for why Dutch people and why Europeans at large are driving manual transmissions. If you haven't been following my channel throughout the past few weeks, I actually just took a very long road trip with my Dutch girlfriend across the US. In fact, we drove a distance equivalent to or even exceeding that of Lisbon to Moscow and back. Now, I don't know about you, but the idea of driving that distance in a manual car fills me with dread. In fact, the idea of making that same drive in an automatic car like I did brings me dread. I was so tired when we finished that trip. So I can only imagine how much more tired I would have been had I driven a manual. That said, once again, I know there is a pragmatic explanation as to why Europeans opt for these kinds of cars, and in this video, I'm hoping to find that pragmatic explanation. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this video.
I'm in a fairly typical street in the UK. Let's take a look at what people are driving. Here is a Ford Fiesta, and that is...
Okay, so a Ford Fiesta, just right off the bat, that's a car that actually my family had. In fact, we had two of them at one point, and the cars didn't really last very long. I think we got them in 2012, and we got them brand new. I say we, my parents got them brand new. By 2015, the transmissions were already shot. Now, we did have the automatic variants of those cars, so I wonder if maybe that was part of the reason why the transmissions didn't last very long. Because based on the body style that I see
what
here,
people are driving. Here is a Ford Fiesta.
It looks like it was a similar year of Ford Fiesta. I could be wrong about that, but this looks like it was from maybe the early 2010s. So if this is still on the road, then I have to imagine that maybe it's possible that manual transmissions simply last longer than automatic transmissions, but I don't know, we'll see.
Fiesta, and that is a manual.
So it's kind of crazy that he's just walking down the street recording inside of people's cars. I don't know, maybe in the UK or Europe that isn't that big of a deal, but I feel like if you do that here in the US, people are going to come out of their houses and confront you about that.
Let's take a look at this Mini across the street.
Saw a lot of Mini Coopers in the Netherlands.
Although the camera didn't, before across the road that is. And that is also a manual. I'm not going to look at this Fiesta because I just looked at that one. So don't need to look at two Fiestas. Let's go and have a look at this Citroen DS3 instead. Was that a manual or an automatic? Also a manual. Now there is a Mercedes C-Class down there. I believe that is automatic because it's the E model, which means it's going to be hybrid. I'm going to have a quick run just to confirm. Yes, C350E.
I'm not gonna lie, and I promise I'm not gonna keep pausing throughout the whole entire video, I promise, but again, this might just be my American mind at work here, but I feel like if you do something like what he's doing in this video in an American neighborhood, people are automatically going to assume that he's recording inside of people's cars so that he can watch the footage to see what they have in the cars, and then later on, maybe at nighttime or at a future date, he can come back and break into the cars and steal what they have in there. Again, this is probably just my American mind at work here, but I don't think this would go over very well in the US.
So that is going to be an automatic, but this is a much more expensive car, and it's also still fairly young, being 5 years old. Yeah, 5. Do your maths, Richard. All petrol and diesel cars need gears. Some change gear automatically for you, and in others you have to change gear manually yourself. All early cars were manual, and the automatic gearbox didn't start to become widely available until the 1930s and 40s, or at least widely available in certain parts of the world. But that's 80 years ago. Why is the manual still so popular today? And in some markets, such as America, the automatic has been the norm for some time now. In fact, in some states, you can actually pass your driving test in an automatic and be allowed to drive a manual.
It's interesting that he said in some states, because growing up in Texas, that was literally not even an assumption, it was just a fact. So I don't know what states allow you to drive an automatic car for your driving test and then drive a manual after receiving your license in an automatic, and which ones don't. But I know that in Europe they definitely make that distinction, and rightfully so. I think it is kind of strange that I could get behind the wheel of a manual and I literally have no idea how to drive a manual, by the way. No idea, never even tried it. The closest I ever came was the paddle shifters in the BMW that I used to have. So I don't think that I should be able to drive a manual without some kind of lessons or something like that, but I can. But in Europe, that is not the case. In Europe, the reverse is true. If you get a license with a manual car, you can then drive an automatic, which makes sense because automatics, I have to imagine, are much easier to drive.
I can only guess this can be allowed because there's so few manuals that it's not a major safety concern. But in the UK, most small, cheap cars are manual. So if people in the UK could pass in an automatic and then drive a manual, we would have somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000 new drivers each year passing in automatics with no manual experience, taking to the road for the first time in their manual. And in a country that has a population of only around 67 million, that's a lot of drivers who don't know how to control their car.
It is.
That could be quite chaotic. In the UK, the manual gearbox is in decline. In 2010, 20% of new cars sold were automatic. And back then, that was considered a lot. By 2018, 43% of new cars sold were automatic. But now, nearly 60% of new cars sold in the UK are automatic. So
if you're from another European country, so if you're from the Netherlands, Germany, or literally any country aside from the UK, and you know the corresponding statistic for your country in terms of the percentage of new vehicles that are automatic, please drop that in the comments below because I'm really curious to hear more about that. I do know that in the Netherlands, I saw quite a few electric cars, and obviously electric cars don't have gears, so they're all automatic by default. So I'd imagine that simply because of the popularization of electric vehicles, you're going to see a much smaller percentage of new cars being manual. But if you know the exact statistic for your country, drop it below.
So although new drivers are still opting to pass their driving test in a manual, over 90% of driving tests are manual, the automatic is becoming the norm. So why has it taken so long for the automatic to start to take off in the UK? Well, it's quite simple. Traditional automatics with torque converters were big, heavy and inefficient. That does not bode well with Asian and European cars. In the UK, we primarily use Asian cars and European cars. However, in America, their cars are already big, heavy and inefficient. They have big 5.7 litre V8s, which they call a 350 cubic inch, with loads of torque, so having a less efficient gearbox doesn't make as much of a difference. And gasoline, as they call it over there, is much cheaper. So having the convenience of an automatic makes more sense because the negatives aren't as noticeable. However, if you were to put a traditional automatic in, say, something like a 1.1 litre Ford Fiesta from the...
Before he even goes any further, something that I kind of noticed about American cars versus cars in the Netherlands and the parts of Europe that I've been to is that I feel like people in Europe will drive older cars like this literally for practicality's sake. Whereas in the US, it's usually more of a novelty thing. I don't think I've ever seen this particular car here in the US. And obviously Ford, this is a Ford Fiesta, he just said, is an American brand. So people here just generally aren't driving older cars like that, much less smaller older cars like that. And something else that he mentioned earlier in the video is that a lot of the cars that are small and cheap are manual. But here, you don't really have small and cheap cars. In fact, there was a point in time when I was looking for a car in the past and I could not find anything for under $5,000 for the life of me, unless it was literally a junkyard car. So I think that's another big difference. And that's something that honestly, here in the US, with it being such a car-dependent country, there should be more cars like this. There should be a lot more small, affordable vehicles for those younger drivers.
From the 1980s, it's going to drive like you've left the handbrake on. But in the early noughties or 2000s, something started to change. It was out with the traditional torque converter planetary gear automatic and in with the robotized manual. Yes, automatics were no longer really automatics. They were actually a manual, but with a robot changing gear for you. So that got rid of the disadvantage of the automatic being less efficient and bigger and heavier. They're almost the same size and same weight. The only disadvantage was the price. Normally it added around 1,000 to 1,500 pounds to the list.
Wait, so basically what he's saying is that automatics used to be like electric engines are now, so no gears, except they were gas powered. That's what I'm gathering. I could be wrong about that. If I'm misinterpreting that, then please enlighten me in the comments. But if that's the case, then I can see why people didn't want to drive automatics, because that sounds really unpleasant and, to his point, inefficient and costly.
The list price of a car, and they worked well in small cars with small engines as well. Therefore, opting to have the extra convenience of the car changing gear for you was no longer such a problem. Well, it was actually convenient. And then the automatic started to become popular. And Japanese manufacturers started to use something called a CVT, which stands for continuously variable transmission. They work well with big engine cars and low powered small engine cars. The only trouble is how they sound. Many people don't like the fact that it actually sounds like your engine is staying at a constant velocity whenever you put your foot hard on the gas. It kind of goes mmm. And in fact, in one of my videos, I made a mistake of calling it a constant velocity transmission just because I was so used to hearing that constant velocity of the engine.
I've never driven one of those before, but I have heard that those CVT transmissions are very unreliable, especially in Nissans. Could be wrong about that, but that's just what I've heard personally. I've heard that they're not ideal if you don't want to be dishing out thousands of dollars every 5 or so years to replace your transmission.
They work well, they are efficient. If you drive gently, don't worry about it. But if you want to put your foot down, they're not very nice. So the reason why it's taken so long for automatics to become popular in the UK is simply because the technology to make a lightweight, low-powered car, which is most of the cars in the UK, automatic yet still drive in a decent way, has only become widely available recently. But does that mean you shouldn't bother learning manual? You should just learn automatic because all cars are going to be automatic soon. Well, the manual is going to be here for a bit longer than you may think. They're going to be sold up until 2030 minimum, when the petrol and diesel ban comes in, and that ban essentially bans manual. However, that...
Wait, he said the petrol and diesel ban in 2030. What's that all about? I think I might have heard about that in passing, but I never really delved any deeper into it. But if you know more about that, then let me know what that's all about in the comments, because I mean, it seems pretty straightforward. It seems like they're going to ban gasoline powered vehicles, but how are they going to go about making that transition into, I'm assuming, electric vehicles? Are they going to subsidize electric vehicles? Are you going to be allowed to keep driving your gas powered vehicle that you already had before? I have to imagine that you would, otherwise I surely would have heard more about this. But yeah, if you know more about that, then definitely let me know in the comments.
That may be delayed, you never know, but let's say the ban happens in 2030, then those cars are still going to be on the road for 10 to 20 years after that. So the manual car will still be popular for quite a while yet.
Okay.
Getting a manual...
He basically just answered my question.
...license does give you the freedom to drive whatever car you want. However, of course, learning automatic is easier. But is there another advantage to driving a manual? Or is it all just about the money? It's not just about the money, it's about the experience. If you're brought up around manuals, learn to drive a manual.
The way his feet are moving right now has me absolutely lost. I do not know what he's doing. I know the clutch is on the right side because he's in a car that's designed for British roads. And generally in the US and much of Europe, the clutch will be on the left side. But in terms of what he's actually doing, I have no idea whatsoever.
Subsequently got good at driving a manual.
Looks
and
like
live somewhere
fun,
where you're not constantly in nose to tail, bumper to bumper traffic. You actually have access to some relatively quiet roads with a half decent speed limit. You may also enjoy driving a manual. It's not guaranteed, of course, not everyone does. It's not everyone's cup of tea. But there are plenty who do. And as a result, with great British country roads, the manual has stayed strong for years.
He made another interesting point right there. It's ideal if you're not going to be in bumper-to-bumper traffic. I think this automatically disqualifies a lot of the US because, again, we just drove across the whole US twice, basically. And especially in big cities like New York and LA, the traffic is treacherous. I'm talking about constant traffic. If you're from Europe, I promise you, the traffic in those cities is worse than anything you'll see in Europe. Anything that I've seen, at least in Europe. Especially the Netherlands. If you're from the Netherlands, I promise you, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, the Randstad, all of that, the traffic doesn't compare. I can guarantee you that. So that also makes sense because there's less traffic in a lot of European countries because they have alternative forms of transportation. So it makes driving a manual a lot more pleasant.
Even though realistically, the economy and how much people earn in this country means that automatics aren't really out of the question. It is a bit of a choice. Now, I could be driving down this road in an automatic, but I know from experience I won't be having as much fun. There is a sense of joy from the achievement of achieving the perfect gear change, the downshift rev match, the heel and toe rev match, under braking, and kissing the red line. Although you can do that in an automatic as well. Of course, drive responsibly. And that's part of what makes driving a manual so special. I didn't break the speed limit there, but I enjoyed myself.
He raises a really good point right there. I do feel like in an automatic car, even with the BMW that I had, it had the paddle shifters, and that was most of the fun that I had with the car. Because other than that, the only other thing you could really do with it was just drive above the speed limit. And obviously that puts you in harm's way, it puts other people in harm's way, and it puts you at risk for losing your license altogether. In which case, you won't be driving an automatic or a manual. You will be walking. And in the US, it's not something you want to be doing. So I definitely see where he's coming from in that regard. But I feel like that only really applies to performance vehicles, vehicles that are designed for recreational use, like that Mazda Miata he's driving. But if you're driving a Ford Fiesta or something that literally serves one purpose, which is to get you from point A to point B, then I feel like that point doesn't really apply. I mean, you're not really driving a lot of those cars for fun. You're driving them for practicality's sake. So I guess to his point, there are other reasons why, but I don't think this point applies in most instances.
A very powerful automatic will shoot you up to very high speeds very quickly without you doing much at all, which leads you wanting to enjoy the speed as opposed to the involvement. So therefore, driving a manual enthusiastically allows you to have fun whilst being safe, because there's something else to enjoy. Of course, manuals aren't for everyone. Some people just prefer automatics. I know both. Some people like auto, some people like manual. A lot of people like manual for the same reasons I do, and many people like automatic because, well, it's easier and they're not really enthusiastic about driving. They just want to get from A to B. Whoever you are, doesn't matter. Enjoy your car. Well, I hope this video helps you understand why manuals are still so popular in the UK.
Okay, so, I mean, that's really what it comes down to. Enjoy the car that you have. Personally, while I do now have a better understanding of why people prefer manual transmissions, I actually like EVs. I don't really like gas-powered vehicles at all. I'd much prefer to drive a Tesla or literally any kind of EV over a gas vehicle, because to me, they just provide a much more seamless driving experience. But if you are someone who's into gasoline-powered cars, then I can see how manual transmissions, especially in those smaller cars, would be a lot more pleasant, a lot more efficient, and a lot more practical in day-to-day life.